The order was already moving before anyone noticed it had begun. It existed first as language, fixed and precise, assembled according to a format that had been used for years. Each sentence followed another. Each clause closed off the one before it. There was no ambiguity in its structure, no room left open. It carried the weight of precedent, stamped and copied in the same manner as countless others, indistinguishable at a glance. The paper bore no urgency in its appearance. The words did not hurry. They did not warn. They simply instructed. It passed from one desk to another without friction. It was read, acknowledged, logged, and sent on. The process was smooth enough to be forgettable. No raised voices accompanied it. No gestures. No pauses longer than regulation allowed. The order did not need emphasis. It was already authoritative by nature. It did not persuade. It assumed compliance as a condition of its existence. As it traveled downward, it was not discussed. It was received, repeated, and confirmed. Each transfer stripped away any trace of origin until the order no longer belonged to anyone. It became a fact of the system, as neutral and immovable as a timetable. Those who handled it treated it the same way they treated every other instruction that passed through their hand, as something to be preserved exactly as written. The language remained unchanged. Verbs stayed in their original tense. Measurements were copied without conversion. Times were recorded precisely, even when the clocks used to mark them were already out of sync. Each reproduction brought with it a sense of correctness, reinforced by the act of repetition itself. The order's authority grew not because it was examined, but because it was consistent. There was no moment where it felt optional. Procedures activated around it automatically. Schedules adjusted. Resources were allocated according to tables prepared long before this specific instruction existed. Movement began not because anyone decided to move, but because movement was the default response. Trains were routed. Signals were prepared. Supplies were counted and recounted, not to question necessity, but to ensure accuracy. Everything required by the order was already waiting for. The system did not ask what the order. It asked only whether it had been received. Those who encountered it felt no alarm. The wording was familiar. The structure was reassuring in its rigidity. It resembled hundreds of other orders that had passed without incident. Its calmness was its strength. It did not hint at consequences. It did not acknowledge risk. It assumed a world that would behave exactly as expected. As the order moved closer to execution, it gained momentum simply by continuing to exist. To stop it would have required interruption, and interruption was not part of the process. The mechanisms in place were designed to prevent delay, not to invite reconsideration. Every safeguard protected the order from alteration, not from. By the time it reached those tasked with carrying it out, it no longer felt like a decision. It felt like an obligation inherited from the structure itself. The order had passed through too many hands to be fragile. It had been validated too many times to be questioned. Its correctness was assumed because it had survived the system intact. Nothing about it suggested catastrophe. Nothing about it needed to. The order was complete, final, and already irreversible. The environment in which the order settled was designed to remove hesitation. Everything within it existed to clarify position and responsibility. Authority was defined spatially as much as verbally, arranged through offices, corridors, and designated points of access. Movement followed prescribed paths. Information traveled in one direction, response in another. No element was redundant. No role overlapped. Each function had been refined over time to do exactly what it was meant to do, and nothing more. At the top of this structure, decisions were abstract. They arrived as concepts, reduced to language and numbers, shaped to fit standardized formats. Below that level, interpretation narrowed. Each layer removed context in favor of instruction. By the time the order reached the lower tiers, it no longer resembled a choice. It resembled gravity. The chain of command was not enforced through threat or fear. It was sustained through routine. Each individual knew precisely where authority ended and where obedience began. This clarity was considered a strength. It eliminated uncertainty. It allowed action to occur without delay. Questions were unnecessary because the structure itself was the answer. The order moved downward step by step, never skipping a level. Each transfer was documented. Each acknowledgement confirmed that the system was functioning as intended. Compliance was not dramatic. It was administrative. The process left no visible trace of strain. If doubt existed anywhere, it had no approved channel through which to travel. Those positioned between issuance and execution served as conduits, not evaluators. Their task was preservation. Alteration would have been a violation of protocol, not because it was forbidden explicitly, but because it was inconceivable. The system rewarded fidelity to form above all else. Precision was valued. Initiative was not required. Meetings occurred, but they were not forums. They were confirmations. Timelines were reviewed, not debated. Resources were matched to requirements already assumed to be correct. When discrepancies appeared, they were resolved by adjusting logistics, never by revisiting the order itself. The instruction was treated as a fixed point around which all other variables had to align. Language within the structure reflected this rigidity. Phrases were standardized. Responses were predictable. Acknowledgments followed expected patterns. No one spoke beyond their assigned scope. Silence was not avoidance. It was discipline. The absence of dissent was interpreted as alignment. The system moved efficiently because it had been designed to do so. Every safeguard protected continuity. Redundancies ensured that the order could survive delays, disruptions, and personnel changes. If one individual was removed, another took their place without altering the flow. The order did not belong to a person. It belonged to the institution. As it descended further, proximity to consequence increased, but awareness did not. Those closest to execution understood the mechanics of their tasks in detail, but the purpose remained distant and undefined. They did not need to know why. They needed to know when and how. The structure ensured they knew both. Hierarchy insulated decision-making from outcome. Responsibility was distributed so evenly that it became invisible. Each participant could point upward for justification and downward for execution. Accountability dissolved into procedure. What remained was function. By the time the order reached its final preparatory stage, it was no longer perceived as an instruction that could succeed or fail. It was simply the next step in an ongoing process. The system had accepted it fully, absorbed it without resistance, and prepared to act. Nothing within the structure suggested the possibility of deviation. Nothing within it allowed for reversal. The order was now embedded, protected by hierarchy, and moving forward exactly as designed. Execution began without announcement. There was no signal to mark the transition from preparation to action. The order did not arrive with urgency or ceremony. It simply crossed an invisible threshold where planning ended and procedure took over. Schedules already aligned themselves around it. Personnel were already positioned. Equipment had already been assigned. When the moment came, it did not feel like a beginning. It felt like continuation. Tasks were performed in sequence, each one activating the next. Movements were synchronized not through communication, but through expectation. Everyone involved knew their window, their timing, their limits. The order required no explanation because it matched the structure that surrounded it. It fit perfectly into routines that had been rehearsed countless times under different circumstances. There was no pause to reassess conditions. Conditions were assumed. The order had been issued under the premise that the environment would conform to it. Execution operated on that same premise. Deviations were not anticipated, because anticipation itself was not part of the instruction. The system had not been designed to interpret reality, only to impose sequence upon it. Coordination was precise. Actions occurred on schedule, even when external cues suggested misalignment. Clocks mattered more than observation. Markers mattered more than sound. Signals were acknowledged because they existed, not because they made sense in the moment. Each confirmation reinforced the illusion of control. No one spoke beyond what protocol required. Communication was limited to verification. A task completed. A position reached. A phase initiated. Language did not carry concern or curiosity. It carried status. Everything was either done or pending. There was no vocabulary for doubt. As the order unfolded, its complexity became apparent only in motion. Multiple elements moved independently, but toward a shared objective defined elsewhere. Their coordination relied entirely on timing calculated in advance. Once set in motion, adjustment would have required interruption, and interruption had no authorized trigger. Individuals focused on their immediate responsibilities. Their awareness extended only as far as their instructions allowed. The system encouraged this narrowing of attention. It was considered efficient. It reduced friction. It ensured that no one became distracted by outcomes beyond their scope. Compliance was exact. Distances were measured as specified. Durations were observed precisely. Formations held even when conditions strained their coherence. The order was not interpreted. It was enacted. Any deviation, however minor, would have been recorded as error. Accuracy was survival within the structure. There were moments when alignment required effort. Delays accumulated at the margins. Small inconsistencies appeared, not as alarms, but as inconveniences to be managed. These were resolved locally, without escalation. The order itself remained untouched, insulated from the friction of reality. The machinery of execution continued to turn, driven by confirmation loops and procedural checkpoints. Each successful step validated the next. Momentum replaced reflection. The longer the order was carried out, the less conceivable it became to stop. No one asked whether the sequence still made sense. The question had no place to surface. The order had already been accepted as correct by virtue of having reached this stage. Execution was proof of legitimacy. Action became evidence. Silence settled in where dialogue might have existed. It was not imposed. It emerged naturally from the structure. Everything necessary was already written. Everything expected was already known. The absence of conversation was a sign that the system was working. By the time the order reached full implementation, it was no longer perceived as a command at all. It had become motion. It had become routine. It had become something that could only be completed. And completion, once begun, allowed no alternative. The first signs did not register as failure. They appeared as minor irregularities, the kind that occurred whenever large systems interacted with an environment that did not fully conform. Timings slipped by small margins. Distances felt longer than projected. Signals arrived intact but slightly delayed, their meaning unchanged, their relevance already diminished. None of this was unusual enough to demand attention beyond routine adjustment. Reports moved upward in the same format as always. Language remained neutral. Deviations were recorded as data, not as warnings. Each irregularity was isolated, stripped of context, and filed where it could be addressed without disturbing the broader sequence. The order itself was not referenced. It did not need to be. The assumption of its correctness remained intact. As execution continued, the environment resisted in subtle ways. Terrain altered movement without announcing itself. Visibility shifted unpredictably. Conditions that had been assumed stable revealed themselves to be variable. These factors were noticed individually, never collectively. The system had no mechanism to assemble them into a single picture. Responses followed protocol. When timing slipped, compensations were made locally. When alignment faltered, formations were corrected to specification. When communication lagged, confirmation was repeated. Each correction treated the symptom, not the structure that produced it. The order remained the constant around which everything else adjusted. Confusion began to appear at the edges. It did not manifest as panic or protest. It took the form of repetition. Instructions were reread. Coordinates were rechecked. Measurements were verified again and again, as if accuracy alone could resolve the growing disconnect between plan and reality. The more the system encountered resistance, the more precisely it attempted to obey. Information flowing upward became fragmented. Each report described a manageable issue, nothing more. No single message contained enough weight to justify interruption. The hierarchy required clarity before escalation, and clarity never arrived in one place. The structure dispersed concern as efficiently as it dispersed responsibility. At lower levels, execution continued with increasing effort. Tasks took longer to complete. Sequences overlapped in unintended ways. Dependencies that had been calculated as stable revealed themselves to be fragile. Still, no adjustment to the order was authorized. Adaptation was limited to execution, not intent. There were moments when the system hesitated, not in action, but in interpretation. Signals were received that did not align with expectations. Markers indicated positions that no longer existed as assumed. These discrepancies were noted, documented, and worked around. The possibility that the order itself was flawed did not surface. The structure offered no path for that conclusion to travel. The order persisted unchanged. As pressure increased, the system's response was to reinforce discipline. Precision was emphasized. Deviations were corrected more aggressively. The language of compliance tightened. What had once been routine became rigid. The order was followed more closely than ever, as if fidelity could compensate for mismatch. Conflicting indications accumulated. Units arrived where they were supposed to be, only to find conditions incompatible with their instructions. Timing windows closed without acknowledgement. Movements occurred exactly as scheduled, but their effects diverged from expectation. The system recorded success in terms of completion, not outcome. Attempts to reconcile reality with instruction multiplied. They did not converge. Each effort operated within its assigned boundary, unaware of similar efforts occurring elsewhere. The hierarchy filtered information not by significance, but by format. Only messages that fit the expected pattern moved upward intact. Everything else was delayed, revised, or reduced. The order remained the reference point. It was not questioned, not revised, not paused. Its authority was procedural, not responsive. The system had been built to execute decisions, not to revisit them once in motion. Momentum now served as its own justification. As inconsistencies became more pronounced, the structure responded by accelerating. Delays were interpreted as inefficiency. Efficiency was restored by increasing pace. The faster the system moved, the less space there was for reassessment. Speed replaced understanding. At no point did the failure announce itself clearly. It emerged gradually, distributed across actions that individually appeared correct. The system continued to function. Commands were acknowledged. Movements occurred. Reports were filed. The machinery of obedience remained intact. What changed was the gap between intention and effect. That gap widened silently, protected by protocol, reinforced by hierarchy, and rendered invisible by the very structure designed to ensure control. Collapse did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded as accumulation. The system continued to execute long after the conditions that had justified the order no longer existed. Movements reached their endpoints even when those endpoints had lost meaning. Timelines were completed, even as their relevance eroded. The machinery of obedience advanced, indifferent to the consequences it was producing. Loss appeared first, as absence. Expected confirmations did not arrive on schedule. Gaps emerged in sequences that had been calculated to be continuous. These gaps were noted, categorized, and recorded as delays or interruptions, not as indicators of systemic failure. The structure treated absence as temporary by default. As execution pressed forward, scale became visible. What had once been isolated irregularities now aligned into patterns. But patterns were not actionable without authorization. Authorization required clarity. Clarity required consolidation. Consolidation never occurred. Information remained partitioned, each segment too small to justify deviation on its own. Resources continued to be committed according to plan. Replacements were deployed to fulfill requirements that no longer reflected reality. Reinforcement followed reinforcement, not because conditions demanded it, but because the order had specified continuation. Momentum ensured compliance long after effectiveness had diminished. The environment absorbed the force of execution unevenly. Some elements progressed without resistance. Others stalled completely. The system interpreted this variance as logistical imbalance rather than structural flaw. Corrections were applied locally, intensifying effort where resistance was greatest. Pressure increased in exactly the areas least able to sustain it. Coordination degraded. Timing that had once aligned began to fracture. Independent actions collided instead of converging. Sequences overlapped where separation had been assumed. The order's internal logic depended on conditions that no longer held, but the logic itself remained intact, protected from contradiction by procedure. Breakdown followed obedience. The system did not recognize collapse, because collapse was not a defined state. There were categories for delay, for disruption, for loss of contact. There was no category for an order failing by being followed exactly. As a result, execution persisted beyond any point of recovery. Scale asserted itself through numbers rather than images. Reports referenced increasing quantities without context. Figures grew. Totals accumulated. Loss was expressed in increments, each one small enough to be processed, none large enough to halt progression. The language remained administrative. There were no adjectives capable of conveying magnitude. The structure responded to mounting strain by enforcing conformity. Deviations were eliminated. Procedures were followed more strictly than ever. Flexibility was interpreted as risk. Discipline became the final defense against disorder, even as discipline itself drove the system further into collapse. At the edges, elements ceased to function. Connections failed permanently rather than temporarily. Replacements could not restore what had been lost. Still, the order did not. Its parameters remained fixed. Its authority remained intact. The system could not acknowledge failure without violating the very principles that sustained it. Eventually, continuation became indistinguishable from destruction. The system reached a point where actions no longer produced intended effects at any scale. Progress ceased to correlate with outcome. Movement continued without purpose. Compliance persisted without result. What remained was not execution, but inertia. Collapse was not declared. It was realized too late to matter. By the time the system could no longer sustain the order, the cost had already been paid in full. The failure did not end with a command to stop. It ended when there was nothing left capable of responding. The order was complete. Its objective was never achieved. Its consequences were. Afterward, the system did not speak about the order. There was no formal acknowledgement that it had failed. No statement was issued to define what happened. The language that followed was careful, procedural, and limited to what could be processed without disturbance. Records were finalized. Logs were closed. Timelines were archived exactly as they had been maintained throughout execution. The order remained intact in documentation, preserved in the same form it had always existed. The structure absorbed the outcome without visible strain. Responsibilities were redistributed quietly. Vacancies were filled according to regulation. Equipment was reassigned. Schedules were adjusted to reflect new baselines, not to revisit old decisions. The system treated the aftermath as a condition to be managed, not a conclusion to be examined. There were no public revisions to doctrine, no immediate changes to protocol. The processes that had carried the order forward continued to operate with minimal alteration. Where gaps existed, they were bridged administratively. Where losses had occurred, they were recorded numerically and incorporated into future planning assumptions. The language remained neutral. Numbers replaced description. Within the hierarchy, the order receded from active reference. It was no longer discussed because it no longer required action. Once execution ended, relevance ended with it. The system had no incentive to revisit what no longer demanded response. Attention shifted to the next instruction already moving through familiar channels. Those who remained within the structure returned to routine. Daily functions resumed according to schedule. Forms were completed. Reports were filed. Training continued. The mechanisms that had enabled the failure proved equally capable of surviving it. Continuity was restored not by reflection, but by repetition. No single point within the hierarchy claimed ownership of the outcome. Authority remained distributed, insulated by layers that had functioned as intended. Each level had performed its role correctly. Compliance had been exact. Procedure had been followed. From the perspective of the system, there was nothing to correct. Silence settled where explanation might have existed. It was not enforced. It emerged naturally from the absence of a category in which the event could be placed. The structure could record losses. It could not process causation when causation was procedural rather than individual. The order existed now only as an artifact, filed, numbered, stored among others that had been completed, amended, or superseded. On paper, it looked no different from any instruction that had produced acceptable results. Its failure was not visible in its wording. Its consequences were external to the document, and therefore external to the system's memory. Over time, references to the event became indirect. Adjustments appeared in later planning, framed as responses to environmental variables rather than structural error. Caution was expressed through revised margins and updated assumptions, never through admission. The system learned without acknowledging that it had been taught. New orders continued to move through the same channels. They were formatted in the same language, processed by the same procedures, protected by the same safeguard. Each one carried the same authority, the same certainty, the same expectation of obedience. The structure remained confident in itself. Nothing within it required remorse. Nothing within it permitted regret. The failure had been absorbed, distributed, and rendered invisible. It did not interrupt the flow. It did not alter the foundation. It became part of the background conditions against which future decisions would be made, unspoken and unnamed. Somewhere within the archives, the order still existed, complete and unchanged. It could be retrieved, reread, and executed again under the same assumptions. The system had ensured that possibility. Authority remained intact. Hierarchy remained unquestioned. And somewhere, another order was already moving.